Most of us think of geography as the study of continents, the names of capitals, perhaps the impact of rivers on human cultures. And certainly geography is all of those. But what if its lens could also bring into focus how one's place impacts identity, how housing and architecture shape expressions of gender, how political and social realities can confine entire communities as readily as liberate them? Joining me today from his home in Phoenix to discuss such questions of geography is Professor Rashad Shabazz, Associate Professor at Arizona State University and author of the book Spatializing Blackness, Architectures of Confinement and Black Masculinity in Chicago. Welcome, Professor Shabazz.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
A pleasure. No doubt viewers are going to pick up on the fact that our conversation focuses on Chicago. But it's my sense that that is largely a function of the fact that you grew up on the south side of Chicago post-1970s and so have firsthand experience there. Is that assumption correct? Can this work be generalized to other American cities as well, perhaps Boston?
Yes, I was born and raised on Chicago's south side during the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, and I got interested in this project because of my relationship to the community and having grown up there. But as I began to do the research and looking at other American cities, I discovered that the particular forms of spatial isolation that happened in Chicago throughout much of the 20th century are applicable to other cities. Black people were spatialized in cities all over the country, and Chicago is just one of the various tales.
So with that understanding, for people, let's start back at the beginning, as it were, yeah? The beginning of the Black experience in Chicago. It's the turn of the 20th century. It's the beginning of the first wave of the Great Black Migration, the mass movement of Black peoples from the Jim Crow South to what they hope is going to be a more open and tolerant North. What they found instead was suspicion and almost immediate efforts to contain them. Why such a greeting?
Well, there's several reasons. One is that when Black people left the South to Chicago and to other industrial northern cities, the hope, as you said, was to be able to experience the full benefits of citizenship and to escape the terrorism of the South. But all of these things didn't necessarily happen, or they didn't happen. What Black people were confronted with was a suspicion that they were criminally intent and that their sexual lives were, I want to use an academic term here, non-normative or non-normal. And that there was all of this anxiety about what would their place in cities like Chicago mean. And this was particularly, caused particular anxiety with respect to race and sex. Chicago had a burgeoning interracial sex zone, if you will. One scholar terms this place the interzones. And it was a vice district that had this sort of underground interracial sex zone where people across race and ethnic lines would dance, they would gather, they would socialize, and some of them would either go home and have sex, or they would have sex in these sort of underground back rooms. And the anxiety was that as Black people moved into Chicago in larger numbers, that the possibilities of sex across the Black-white divide would become normal and would spread. And that this would effectively do two things. One, it would turn the city into a kind of libidinal playground for, cross-racial sex. And the other thing that it would do is that it would radically transform or taint whiteness. As whiteness is sort of coming into its own in the early part of the 20th century, the whole idea of what it means to be white is still being constructed, and that Black people's entrance into the gene pool, if you will, would fundamentally transform whiteness. So the city developed, and the political establishment became deeply anxious about Black people's presence. And so as a result, that place of libidinal, interracial sexual exchange and socializing, it had to go. So the city began to press to ensure that that place disappeared.
It should be said, Southern blacks were not the only people looking to call Chicago home around this time. There was an influx of Europeans as well. The dynamics between the two groups were at times tense, and you refer to a specific date, I think in July of 1914, a German-born police captain, I believe, was appointed head of a South Side police precinct, and that sort of shifted the dynamics in that area. Yes.
Yes.
What was it that happened, and how did it serve to further constrain the lives of Black Chicagoans?
What we began to see is that all of those groups began, sort of vying for or fighting for the various resources that were available. Who's going to be able to vote, who's going to be able to work. And what we see is that the Germans develop a certain relationship to industrial production, particularly through public sector work, largely in things like policing. And one of them is this man by the name of Max Newbar, who was a well-trained, highly educated man in Germany. He came here in the latter part of the 19th century, became part of the Chicago Police Department, and in the early 20th century, in the years, in the few years after the First World War, there was this effort to clean up the interracial sex zones that was happening in Chicago. He becomes embroiled in a controversy about closing down an establishment, and this establishment was a well-known Black and Tan. Black and Tans were places on the South Side, mostly in the Black Belt, that serviced people who were looking for this interracial social scene. And he closed down. The name of the place was called the Onion Club. He closed it down, and he made a very provocative statement. And he said that places like the Onion Club should be closed down because they're a threat to whiteness, and they're a threat to the purity of white women, and any white woman caught in that place should be punished. And he said something even worse by saying if he caught his own daughter in there, that he would punish her severely. And so this began a campaign to what was known as, quote, clean up the Black Belt, end quote. And what that meant was to get rid of all of these places of interracial libidinal desire. And the Onion Club was the beginning of it. And as a result, large-scale police power began to move into the Black Belt in order to rid the Black Belt of this sort of interracial scene. And as a result, the quest to clean up the Black Belt became a mechanism to effectively police the entire Black Belt. Right? And not only that, but the Chicago Police Department was able to modernize as a result of that. The police force expanded. New techniques of policing were created. New laws were produced, right? And this effectively put the entire Black Belt under the suspicion of criminal activity and so on, right? So policing interracial sex really became a way to police the entire Black Belt.
We should say the Black Belt is an area of, what, I think 7 miles long, 1 mile wide.
Absolutely.
Largely the place, given restrictive covenants that are going on around this time, that the Black Chicagoans have to live, yes? That we can talk about all of the constraints they were under and ask why simply didn't they move. They didn't have the freedom, effectively, politically, socially, to move out of the Black Belt. Is that more or less accurate?
Absolutely. As Black people began to migrate in large numbers to the city around 1916, 1917, all of the housing in other parts of the city was closed off to them through restrictive covenants. And restrictive covenants were legal mechanisms to foreclose Blacks, Asians, Mexican immigrants, and some Eastern European, Jews particularly, to foreclose housing options to them. And the only part of the city that was available to them was this small strip of land on the south side that became known as the Black Belt. And the Black Belt was it was small, and as more Black people began to migrate to the city, the Black Belt was filled to capacity.
Right.
Decade after decade,
Right.
effectively creating this containment unit that
Right.
Blacks were forced to live in. So they couldn't migrate to other parts of the city because they were not allowed to purchase or to rent housing there.
I think the statistics that I recall from the book, in terms of speaking of how densely populated the Black Belt was, does 90,000 people per square mile sound
Yes.
about right?
Yes, 90,000 per.
As opposed to 20,000 people per square mile in other areas of the city. Yeah.
Absolutely. It was densely packed, and the way that all of those people were able to fit in that place is also an interesting story.
Right.
On the south side, there were numerous apartment complexes and old mansions that had been sort of left over from the aristocracy of the 19th century. And those houses and apartments, or those mansions and apartments, were divided up into smaller units. And these smaller units were known as kitchenettes. Right. And a kitchenette was basically a 2-bedroom apartment or a 3-bedroom mansion that was cut up into multiple units to accommodate multiple families. So, for example, a 3-bedroom apartment might accommodate 5 or 6 people. A 3-bedroom kitchenette accommodated 4 different families. Wow. One family living in 1 bedroom, another in the other, another in the third, and another family that lived in the living room. And they were called kitchenettes because there was a small kitchenette unit, which was a stovetop and an ice box that was plugged into the wall that allowed the family to cook and to store food.
You're in one room in a kitchenette. You share this with your family. There's very little sense of privacy, if any, I imagine. It's very clear the limits of your space, and perhaps also by extension, the prospects of one's life.
Absolutely.
And how did that impact the formation of identity in Black males in that era?
So space is really important because what space does is it illuminates conditions of possibility. It makes visible how things like mobility or agency or where one's position in the social hierarchy is right. And space is one of those material things that demonstrates that. And this is something that geographers and people who are interested in this kind of stuff have been writing about for decades. And so in looking at the kitchenette, we see that kitchenettes had a very adverse impact on the production and performance of Black masculinities in Chicago, because what they did was they illustrated to Black men that all of those tenets of masculinity which were dominant at the time, mobility, access to institutions, economic mobility, none of those things were present in the lives of these, or few of those things were present in the lives of many of these Black men. And then you have this space that is restrictive and small and confining and dirty and expensive and infested with rats and all of these things, right? So what we begin to see is that as a way to negotiate their geographic conditions, Black men began to perform forms of masculinity that enabled them to deal with their material or environmental realities, right? So this meant things like hostility or anger or just simple flight, just leaving, right? Became outward expressions of the inability to ascertain these sort of dominant narratives of, what feminists call patriarchal power or male authority, right? Not being able to do that while also being spatially isolated at the same time, right? And so these became some of the ways that they negotiated.
I suppose the good news, is that in the years following the Second World War, The federal government comes and makes a promise to black residents in cities like Chicago, the promise of better housing. Is that what they got? Was it qualitatively better than the kitchenettes that preceded them?
Yeah, so in 1949, 1954, the two housing acts came out of Congress, and these acts were specifically focused on the growing slum housing in cities all over the country. And the point of this housing, of these acts, was to provide funding to create what we know as public housing. The sole purpose of post-war housing projects was to move people into the middle class by allowing them to pay subsidized rent for a number of years so that they can afford the down payment on a house. Like, that was the entire political purpose, right? So post-war housing projects were supposed to be temporary housing. Okay. That was the entire purpose, right? Yeah. Everyone wanted to be in this housing, right? It was new, it was big, and it was filled with children. There were children everywhere, new families. And for a period of time, this was some of the best housing stock on the South Side. But then we see the collapse of the post-war economy, and the industrial labor that many of the people that lived in those housing projects worked in disappeared. Mills closed or fled to capital-friendly states. And poverty and instability grew rapidly within those housing projects. And rather than respond to this poverty and instability with things like education, job training, and job programs, what the city of Chicago and the federal government did was they responded to this instability with police power and mechanisms of containment. So what we began to see is from the 1960s onward, we see policing and surveillance and containment play a larger role in the lives of people in those housing projects than education, job training, and repairs.
The war on drugs is launched, and effectively overnight changes what were minor drug offenses into criminal issues. And effectively overnight changes the landscape in the Black Belt, particularly for black men. What was the impact of the war on drugs at that time?
The war on drugs is without a doubt the most draconian piece of political legislation of the 20th century, because it's impacted poor and working class people of color all over the nation for roughly 4.5 decades at this point. What the drug war did, it enabled that group that was contained to become the raw material for the production of a new kind of industry, for the production of mass incarceration. So Black Chicago was the place that the state of Illinois used to mine for prisoners in downstate and upstate prisons, right? So we began to see a different kind of migration, if you will. Young Black people, the majority of which were Black men, nonviolent offenders, mostly drug crimes, moving from the South and the West sides of Chicago to downstate and upstate prisons. This rotation continues to this day. The overwhelming majority of the state's prisoners, the overwhelming majority, come from a handful of zip codes on the West and the South side, right? The state of Illinois has roughly 90,000 prisoners. And every year, 30% of them are paroled. Roughly a third of them are paroled. Nearly 60% of those go back to 16 zip codes on the West and South side. So what we see is a concentration of the state's prisoners coming from a handful of communities, right? And this has created multiple generations of people having relationship to the criminal justice system. And this affects voting, it affects health, it affects the ability to acquire a job. And because of the legislation of the 1990s, it cuts them off from having access to college loans, which we know
Yeah.
has everything to do with being able to live a more economically secure life. So what we've seen is that parts of the Black Belt, parts of Black Chicago in general, have seen a dramatic uptick in the number of people who are former prisoners living in that community, and that has had deep and profound implications for everyone living there.
Sure. You say that certainly these policies and the impact that they have on the community continues to this day. What can you say about Chicago and Black Chicago today? You end the book with some measure of hope that there is the possibility that things can shift, but it's a measured hope, I think. Yeah.
Yes.
How can you sort of tell us a little bit about what's going on today there?
So Chicago is dealing with something that many cities across the country is dealing with, and that is gentrification.
Mm-hmm.
Parts of the city are becoming more affluent and less Black or brown.
Mm-hmm.
You know? And this is transforming the very dynamic of the city. Mm-hmm. But what it's ultimately doing is it's pushing poor people out. Mm-hmm. And the more affluent are getting access to the spaces of cultural production and entertainment and urban mobility, and the poor are getting pushed out further and further. So that's something that all cities across the country, Boston, New York, Miami, everyone, all cities are dealing with this. But I do think that there is hope, because gentrification has been a response to the politics of segregation and containment. And as those places that have been racially and economically segregated, because they are cheaper, mm-hmm. that land becomes ripe for development. Right. And so I end the book by talking about how poor and working class Blacks on the south side of Chicago are trying to create new landscapes for themselves without having much in terms of economic or political resources. Mm-hmm. So in various parts of the south side, abandoned lots are being transformed into green spaces. Right. Now, these green spaces do many things. One, green spaces create beauty. Mm-hmm. Even a nature-averse person like myself, there's something really beautiful about sitting in a place that has trees and bushes and flowers and mm-hmm. grass and bees humming and, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. hummingbirds. Like, there's something really beautiful about that. But researchers have demonstrated that people who live near green spaces have lower levels of stress, mm-hmm. that they're places where people can create exercise, that they're places that communities can gather, right? That green spaces become places to do that, right? And that's something that's very important to poor and working class communities all over the country, right? It's not only Black Chicago. Sure. The Roxbury section of Boston needs it. Mm-hmm. South Bronx needs it. Mm-hmm. South Central LA needs it. South Phoenix needs it, right? So those things are important. But green spaces also can serve another function. They can also become agricultural spaces where people who don't have access to fresh fruits and vegetables can get access to them, right, mm-hmm. at a reasonable price. Mm-hmm. And this has a profound impact on the health of the entire community, because now people can get fruits and vegetables, and they can do it right in their neighborhood, right? They don't have to get on a bus or take mm-hmm. a train or get in an Uber or a cab and pay a lot of money to go get it. They can walk 2 blocks and they can get fresh potatoes and tomatoes and collard greens and other things, right? Mm-hmm. And so I end the book by talking about the way that poor and working class people can actively transform what had one time been landscapes of containment and carceral punishment into fertile ground.
It is completely my sense, Rashad, that we could continue talking for a significantly longer period of time, and there's certainly a wealth of insights that you provide in the book. But let me at this point just ask if there's anything else that we haven't talked about today that you imagine could be of use to viewers as they try to understand both the history as well as maybe a path forward out of what you've been talking in the book about?
2 years ago now, almost 2 years ago, we heard or we saw on Twitter the words Black Lives Matter. Mm-hmm. And since then, it has become a lightning rod where, many white Americans see Black Lives Matter as anti-white, mm-hmm. and they're critical of the political reasons for it. This book is in many ways an attempt to demonstrate why Black Lives Matter. Mm-hmm. The entire political point of Black Lives Matter is to illustrate to the entire nation that Black people are dealing with a very specific set of problems that impacts the quality and longevity of their lives. Mm-hmm. That is the entire point. Mm-hmm. And Spatializing Blackness is an attempt to do that from a geographic and gender perspective. It's an attempt to catalog how segregation, urban planning, mechanisms of containment produced poverty, health imbalances, mm-hmm. and forms of punishment that have devastated Black communities all across the nation. This book helps us to give a sense of what that political chant means. So I guess I would say that if you want to understand what Black Lives Matter means and why it's relevant and why white people should be invested in it, then Spatializing Blackness is an attempt to make that clear.
Very good. Well, I can't thank you enough for joining me today, Rashad. I think even more for having the vision, certainly exerting the effort, and having the creativity to marry race studies with geography and use those as tools for helping us understand the experience of Black peoples in Chicago, and by extension, certainly in other American cities.
It's been a real pleasure to be here. I really hope that people enjoy our interview, and I'd love to come back and do it again sometime.
Excellent. Professor Shabazz and I sat down to this interview over 6 months ago. In the interim, the local Black Lives Matter movement has been challenged by some police organizations in the wake of the shootings of police officers in Dallas and Baton Rouge. They've questioned the appropriateness of the BLM banner above Somerville Town Hall. They've implied that because these shootings were carried out by African American men, the entire BLM movement is somehow delegitimated and their claim nullified. But the weight of history and contemporary experience is not on their side. In fact, Professor Shabazz's story of Chicago becomes all the more meaningful in explaining the context that these officers seem to be missing. To be a police officer in this day and age is a weighty burden, to be sure, as it is for their spouses and children who come eventually to realize that mom or dad is at more risk than most. I personally can't imagine living under that cloud. But police officers needn't, as a matter of fact, observe the rite of passage that many African American parents feel compelled to, counseling their tweens and teens, especially their boys, that they are, if ever stopped by a police officer, to do whatever he or she directs without question. This is by no means the only difference between the two groups, yet an instructive one, not chosen, but worn on the skin for all with eyes to see, but lacking in context and empathy. I, for one, bow in deep gratitude to Somerville Mayor Curtatone for his principled stand, and invite you all to do the same. For Rashad Shabazz, I'm Peter Bermudez. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Wide Angle.